we've talked about the 3 general and 5 more specific divisions of the brain. You need to mostly focus on the 3 general divisions. Let's walk through the first one of those 3, the hindbrain. So the hindbrain is sitting at the base of your brain stem. You'll see this whole structure here being the brain stem, sort of a stem with the cerebrum on top of it. There's a few structures in this brain stem that are part of the hindbrain, that sort of first structure to develop off of your spinal cord. And these are going to have some really basic functions for your survival. You've heard of some of these structures, I believe. So you've got the medulla on the bottom. You should be able to identify that in a picture. You've got the pons, which is a bit of a kind of a bridge across the brain stem like this, right above the medulla. The cerebellum is this kind of little brain, kind of striated brain hanging off of the back here of the brainstem, and then running up and down this structure, you've got a set of structures called the reticular formation. And those are going to be the 4 parts that we consider to be part of or the most important parts of the hindbrain. So what do they do? Well, the medulla has an important function of being the last separation between your brain and your spinal cord. So really all signals to and from the body are going to need to go through the medulla. So that's going to be part of it. But it doesn't just serve as a road. It also has some role in your vital body functions and maintaining homeostasis. So by vital body functions, I mean breathing, maintaining body temperature, maintaining your heart rate and your blood pressure, essentially keeping you alive. And by homeostasis, I mean maintaining a relatively neutral or functional status of your body functions, right? In terms of your heart rate and your blood pressure, so that it doesn't go too high or too low for your survival. Okay, so without the medulla, you die, of course, right? Which is why decapitation, for example, has been a technique for execution, because decapitation will sever typically either the very high part of the spinal cord directly near to the medulla or the medulla itself, effectively cutting off vital body functions almost immediately. The pons, just dorsal to the medulla, is going to be the bridge between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. The cerebrum being sort of the cap of the brain. Most of the forebrain is going to be in the cerebrum. The cerebellum is going to be that little brain hanging off of the back. So there's going to be some connections then between the cerebellum and the rest of your brain, and those connections go through the pons. The pons also helps with vital body function so that the medulla isn't on its own for that. The other thing that the pons does, as it's kind of connecting some things here at the base of the brain, is that there are going to be some nerves called cranial nerves that are actually part of the peripheral nervous system, but they're going to go out to areas around your head. Now, you don't need to know all of these cranial nerves, but these are going to do things like control your eye blinking, control your facial muscles, your smiling, that sort of thing. And those nerves are going to come right off of the pons instead of having to go down your spinal cord at all, like the other nerves that go out to your hands and that sort of thing. So they'll come right off the pons for the most part. Okay, so that's what the pons does. It's sort of this kind of bridge function connecting the cerebellum and the cerebrum, but also connecting that brain stem to some of the areas in and around your head. The reticular formation I mentioned is sort of this net-like structure. It's a bunch of different nuclei that run up and down the brainstem. One of the most important things that the reticular formation does is something called the reticular activating system, which is involved in arousal, sleep, and basic attention. And here we mean basically just being conscious at all, being aware at all. So when you fall asleep and you go unconscious, the reticular activating system will have a role in shutting that down. When you become conscious, both in dreaming and waking, the reticular activating system will activate to lead to some of that consciousness, okay, some of that attention, some of that arousal. Okay? And so, if you've ever sort of woken up with a start or been falling asleep and sort of jerked awake, that's your reticular activating system, at least in part, waking you up. The cerebellum is the last part of the hindbrain here. Cerebellum means little brain. You can see it almost looks like a little brain on the back. It's got some interesting features to it in that it's got these sort of um, tree-like structures of neurons. These are actually bundles of neurons, ganglia, in fact, running all throughout the cerebellum that sort of like look like tree branches. So the structure of the neurons here are a little different than they are in the rest of the brain, which is interesting. The cerebellum is connected off of the back of the brainstem here, connected to the pons. You can see the pons here. And it has a really important role in your balance and coordination. We might call this your sensory motor function. So being able to move and sense your balance in space eventually gets coordinated most directly from the cerebellum. So if your cerebellum gets damaged, you'll have issues with balance and coordination. Now, this might seem a bit odd to have so much of your brain dedicated to balance and coordination, but I'll note that this right here is not a human brain. This is, in fact, a sheep's brain, and you'll see that the size of the cerebellum is quite big in other animals, maybe even more so relative to their brains than ours. And if you think about the role of balance and coordination in survival, you'll see that it's quite functional, right? So if you weren't able to stand up and move, then you certainly would have difficulty surviving. So the brains of animals and human animals, dedicating quite a bit of space to this function, um, makes a little bit more sense if we think about how important that is. Also, how complicated it is to actually coordinate your whole body like that. As a note, we used to think the cerebellum was really only involved in kind of basic balance, like standing up and not falling down. But it also seems to get involved when we balance other things, even sort of like metaphorical balance of things, like balancing your checkbook or balancing an equation in algebra or balancing the moral rights and wrongs of two different decisions. Oftentimes we activate our cerebellum when we're doing that. And one of the ways to think about this is through embodied cognition. Like our bodies are sort of actually simulating the balance of these two decisions or these two parts of the equation. And our cerebellum, as we kind of balance that, gets involved too, because that's where we balance. And so, interesting role for the cerebellum, maybe in more complex processing too. Okay, that's going to cover the hindbrain. In the next video, we'll cover the midbrain and then the forebrain.